July 1944. The air hung thick and heavy, pregnant with the stench of cordite and decay above the scarred landscape near the Narva River. A brutal, largely forgotten chapter of World War II was about to be etched into the earth, a confrontation on the fault line of empires, a contest for survival waged amidst the whispering pines and the sombre birch forests that straddle the border between Russia and Estonia. This was to be the crucible of the Blue Hills, a name whispered with dread and defiance, a testament to the ferocious will of men caught in the grinding gears of total war. A clash between the remnants of Hitler's foreign legions, the Waffen SS, and the relentless tide of the Soviet war machine, a human drama played out on a stage drenched in blood. Some 22,000 souls, soldiers of fortune and ideological zealots from the shattered remnants of the Nordland and Netherland divisions, stood poised against a seemingly endless horizon of red. Before them massed several Soviet armies, a staggering force numbering nearly 150,000 troops, tanks, and artillery pieces poised to unleash hell. The odds were insurmountable, the outcome seemingly preordained. Yet these men, bound by duty, ideology, or simply the instinct to survive, prepared to meet the storm. Before we delve into the maelstrom of the Blue Hills, a brief reckoning of the events that led to this bloody impasse is essential. The narrative of the Eastern Front is one of relentless attrition, of staggering losses and unimaginable brutality, a conflict where the stakes were nothing less than the survival of nations, the ideological supremacy of systems, the very definition of humanity itself. In mid-January 1944, the Soviets, emboldened by growing industrial capacity and unwavering resolve, launched their final offensive to shatter the German siege of Leningrad, a siege that had lasted for 2.5 agonizing years, a testament to human endurance and the depths of human depravity. This offensive, fueled by righteous fury and a desire for retribution, pushed the German lines back, forcing them to establish a new defensive perimeter in February, anchored by the Narva River and the vast expanse of Lake Peipus. This line, however, was not a bulwark of strength but a fragile shield, stretched thin and strained to the breaking point. From February to July, the Red Army, like a wounded bear smelling blood, launched a series of relentless assaults against the German defences, each attack a wave of fire and steel crashing against a rocky shore. Their objective was clear: to break through the German lines, to seize the Baltic states, to sever the vital supply lines that sustained the German war effort. Wave after wave of Soviet infantry, supported by legions of tanks and relentless artillery barrages, crashed against the German positions. The defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a desperate tenacity, fueled by fear and a fierce determination to hold the line. Each metre of ground was contested, each bunker a scene of savage close-quarters combat, each day a testament to human endurance under unimaginable stress. Estimates suggest that the Soviets, in their relentless drive, suffered close to 300,000 casualties during these major offensives and smaller probing attacks, a staggering toll that underscored the ferocity of the fighting and the unwavering commitment of the Red Army to achieve its objectives. Amidst this carnage, tales of individual heroism and audacious acts of defiance emerged from the fog of war, flickering flames of courage in the darkness. During the major offensive in March, one such figure rose from the ranks: Philip Wild, a Panther tank commander of the Nordland Division. His name would become legend, a whispered testament to bravery and skill on a battlefield of unprecedented destruction. In a single, daring action, Wild, at the head of his armoured behemoth, single-handedly destroyed some 14 T-34 tanks, blunting the Red Army's breakthrough and halting their advance in its tracks. His actions, a testament to his tactical acumen and unwavering resolve, earned him the coveted Knight's Cross, a symbol of valour and recognition of extraordinary service in the face of overwhelming odds. His achievement, though a fleeting victory in a larger context of impending defeat, served as a potent symbol of resistance, a reminder that even in the darkest of hours, courage and determination could make a difference. Despite the localized successes and the heroic stands like that of Philip Wilde, the overall strategic situation on the Eastern Front was rapidly deteriorating for the Germans. While they managed to contain the Soviet advance near the Narva River, other sectors of the front were collapsing like sandcastles before a rising tide. The relentless pressure of the Red Army, coupled with crippling shortages of manpower and resources, was taking its toll on the German war machine, straining it to the breaking point. On June 22, 1944, the Red Army unleashed Operation Barbarossa, one of the largest and most devastating military operations in history. This massive assault, meticulously planned and executed with overwhelming force, targeted Army Group Center in Byelorussian, shattering its defences and creating a gaping hole in the German lines. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented, the losses catastrophic. Entire divisions were annihilated, the German command structure thrown into disarray, the momentum of the war irrevocably shifted in favour of the Soviets. The collapse of Army Group Center left Army Group North, entrenched near Narva, in an extremely precarious position, vulnerable to encirclement and isolation along the Baltic coast. The strategic implications were dire, threatening to sever the German hold on the Baltic states and cripple their ability to maintain control over the region. The spectre of being cut off, of facing annihilation far from the fatherland, loomed large in the minds of German commanders. General Johannes Friesner, commander of Army Group North, recognized the gravity of the situation and proposed to Hitler a strategic withdrawal of all his troops to the vicinity of Riga, a move that would shorten the lines of defence and consolidate their forces. But Hitler, blinded by ideological dogma and a refusal to acknowledge the harsh realities on the ground, rejected the proposal outright. His response was unequivocal. His troops were to stand their ground on the Narva River, to defend the line to the last man, regardless of the cost. Such pronouncements, delivered from the safety of his bunker, were divorced from the brutal realities of the Eastern Front, where men were being ground to dust in a war of attrition. Friesner, however, knew that Army Group North, weakened by months of relentless fighting and deprived of vital reserves, could hardly withstand another major Soviet offensive. The situation was critical, the stakes impossibly high. He persisted, arguing that a stubborn defence of the Narva line would only lead to the eventual destruction of his forces, achieving nothing but a Pyrrhic victory. Finally, Friesner proposed a compromise, a withdrawal to a new defensive line, the Tannenberg Line, located only 15 kilometres west of Narva, a far cry from the 400 kilometres to Riga. This new line, anchored by the strategic heights of the Blue Hills, offered a more defensible position, a chance to regroup and to stem the Soviet advance, and after further deliberation, Hitler, grudgingly and with ill grace, granted his approval. As the Germans prepared to withdraw to the Tannenberg Line, a sense of grim resignation settled over the troops. They knew that the respite would be brief, that the fighting would be even more intense, but at least they would have a chance, however slim, to survive. The withdrawal, however, was not to go unopposed. On July 24th, the Soviets, sensing weakness and opportunity, launched a new massive attack on the Narva sector, catching the Germans off guard and throwing their carefully laid plans into disarray. The assault, spearheaded by overwhelming artillery barrages and waves of infantry, struck with devastating force, shattering the German lines in several key sectors. The attack sowed panic among some German units, their morale already frayed by months of relentless fighting. Some formations broke, abandoning their positions and retreating in disarray, opening gaps in the German defences that the Soviets quickly exploited. By July 25th, many German units, attempting to retreat west of Narva, found themselves trapped in a narrow corridor near the town of Sinemed. Their retreat route threatened by the advancing Soviet forces, the spectre of encirclement looming large. To bolster their defences and prevent a complete collapse, units of the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, under the command of the experienced and ruthless General Felix Steiner, were strategically deployed to take advantage of 3 dominant hills in the Cinemede sector. These 3 hills, known collectively as the Blue Hills, formed a natural defensive barrier, offering commanding views of the surrounding terrain and providing vital protection against the advancing Soviet forces. These 3 heights, the Eastern Hill, known to the Estonians as Orphanage Hill, the Central Grenadier Hill, and the westernmost Love Hill or Tower Hill, would become the focal point of the coming battle, the scene of unimaginable carnage and desperate acts of heroism. The 3 hills, like ancient sentinels, stood as silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Their steep slopes, rising between 20 and 50 metres above the surrounding terrain, offered a natural advantage to the defenders, providing excellent fields of fire and making assaults a daunting and bloody undertaking. The ground was rugged, the terrain unforgiving, a landscape sculpted by glaciers and hardened by time. The forest that once covered the hills had been reduced to tangled masses of shattered trees and splintered wood by months of artillery bombardment, creating a hellish landscape of mud, shattered timber, and exposed earth. The strategic importance of the Blue Hills was undeniable. They controlled the vital road leading west, the only remaining escape route for the German forces trapped near Narva. Holding these heights was crucial to preventing a Soviet breakthrough and maintaining a semblance of order in the face of impending defeat. Steiner, a veteran of countless battles, recognized the importance of the terrain and deployed his forces accordingly, seeking to maximize their defensive capabilities and to exploit the natural advantages offered by the hills. He understood that the coming battle would be a desperate struggle for survival, a contest of wills fought to the bitter end, where victory would go to the side that could endure the most punishment and maintain its resolve in the face of overwhelming odds. The disposition of the 3rd SS Panzer Corps in the Cinemede sector reflected the desperate circumstances faced by the German forces. The 4th SS Panzer Grenadier Brigade Netherland, comprised of Dutch volunteers and hardened veterans, entrenched itself on the left flank of the Tannenberg Line, tasked with holding the northern approaches to the Blue Hills. These men, motivated by a mixture of ideological conviction and a desire for adventure, were known for their fierce fighting spirit and their unwavering loyalty to the SS. They were a bulwark of steel on a crumbling front, determined to hold their ground against the advancing Soviet hordes. In the centre of the line stood units of the 20th Waffen SS Grenadier Division Estonia, composed of Estonian conscripts and volunteers fighting to defend their homeland from Soviet reoccupation. These men, deeply attached to their land and fiercely protective of their families, fought with a desperate tenacity, fueled by a hatred of the Soviet regime and a determination to preserve their independence. They were the heart and soul of the Tannenberg Line, the embodiment of Estonian resistance against foreign domination. On the right flank, anchoring the southern approaches to the Blue Hills, was the 11th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland, a multinational formation comprised of Scandinavian volunteers and battle-hardened German veterans. These men, imbued with a sense of racial superiority and a fervent belief in the Nazi ideology, were among the most fanatical and ruthless soldiers in the German army. They were a force to be reckoned with, capable of inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy and holding their ground in the face of overwhelming odds. Finally, the SS Division Langemark, another formation of Flemish volunteers, was placed in reserve, ready to reinforce any sector of the line that came under heavy attack. These men, like their Dutch counterparts in the Netherland Brigade, were motivated by a complex mix of ideological conviction and a desire for adventure. They were a highly mobile and versatile force, capable of reacting quickly to changing battlefield conditions and providing vital support to the hard-pressed defenders on the front lines. Soviet Marshal Leonid Govorov, commanding the Leningrad front, recognized the Tannenberg Line as the key to breaking through the German defences and gaining access to the Baltic states, He understood that the capture of the Blue Hills would open the way for a rapid advance westward, cutting off Army Group North and potentially leading to its complete destruction. He was determined to seize these strategic heights at any cost, and he massed his forces accordingly, preparing to unleash a storm of fire and steel upon the German defenders. Govorov gathered the best units at his disposal to spearhead the assault, selecting seasoned veterans and battle-hardened formations for the task. The Second Shock Army, renowned for its tenacity and its willingness to absorb heavy casualties, was assigned the task of attacking the German positions from the east, spearheading the assault on Orphanage Hill and Grenadier Hill. These men, hardened by years of brutal fighting, were driven by a deep hatred of the enemy and an unwavering commitment to the Soviet cause. Simultaneously, the Soviet Eighth Army, reinforced with additional infantry divisions and tank regiments, was tasked with attacking the German positions from the south, focusing its efforts on Love Hill and the western approaches to the Tannenberg Line. These men, many of them fresh conscripts and inexperienced recruits, were thrust into the crucible of battle, facing a baptism of fire that would test their courage and their resolve to the breaking point. In total, approximately 22,200 Axis soldiers, half of them Estonian and the other half from countries such as Norway, Holland and Denmark, stood poised to face a Soviet force numbering nearly 150,000 troops. The disparity in manpower was staggering, the odds stacked heavily against the defenders, yet these men, outnumbered and outgunned, prepared to meet the storm driven by a mixture of fear, duty and ideological conviction. The disparity in armoured vehicles was even more lopsided, a testament to the overwhelming industrial might of the Soviet Union. It is estimated that the total number of tanks on the German side was between 80 and 90, a paltry force compared to the Soviet armoured juggernaut, which boasted approximately 1,800 tanks. These included some of the new IS-2 heavy tanks, formidable machines capable of withstanding even the most powerful German anti-tank weapons. The Germans faced a desperate situation, relying on their skill, their training, and their determination to compensate for their lack of material. Finally, it should be noted that German General Friesner, the architect of the withdrawal to the Tannenberg Line, was abruptly removed from command just as the retreat was underway. The reasons for his dismissal remain shrouded in mystery, but it is likely that Hitler, dissatisfied with his performance and unwilling to accept any compromise on the Eastern Front, sought to replace him with a more compliant and ideologically aligned commander. Ferdinand Schörner, a fanatical Nazi and a ruthless disciplinarian, was appointed in his stead, assuming command of Army Group North just as it was poised on the brink of annihilation. Schörner's appointment, while intended to strengthen the German resolve, did little to alter the fundamental strategic situation. The odds remained stacked heavily against the defenders, and the coming battle would be a desperate struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. On July 26, 1944, the storm broke. The Soviet offensive, long anticipated and meticulously planned, crashed against the Tannenberg Line with the fury of 1,000 tempests. Pursuing the retreating Germans, the Soviet forces surged forward, eager to exploit any weakness and to shatter the German defences before they could fully consolidate their positions. The Soviet Air Force dominating the skies rained down a torrent of bombs and rockets upon the German positions, turning the landscape into a smoking wasteland. The earth trembled under the relentless explosions, the air filled with the acrid stench of burning fuel and the screams of the wounded and dying. The German defenders, caught in the open and exposed to the aerial onslaught, suffered heavy casualties, their morale shaken by the sheer scale of the attack. Following the aerial bombardment, the Soviet artillery opened fire, unleashing a devastating barrage of shells upon the German lines. The ground shuddered under the impact of the explosions, the air filled with the deafening roar of the guns. The forests that had once covered the hills were reduced to smouldering wreckage, the German bunkers and trenches pulverized by the relentless shelling. The German defenders, huddled in their foxholes and bunkers, endured the bombardment with stoic resolve, waiting for the inevitable infantry assault that would follow. The Soviet 21st and 256th Rifle Divisions, supported by the 98th Tank Regiment, spearheaded the assault on the SS Nordland Division positions, focusing their attack on the eastern slopes of Orphanage Hill. These men, hardened veterans of countless battles, advanced with unwavering determination, their bayonets fixed and their faces grim. They had faced death countless times before, and they were prepared to face it again, driven by a deep hatred of the enemy and an unwavering commitment to the Soviet cause. The initial assault struck with devastating force, overwhelming the forward German positions and pushing the defenders back towards the crest of the hill. The fighting was fierce and brutal, a chaotic melee of close-quarters combat. German and Soviet soldiers clashed in hand-to-hand fighting, bayonets and knives flashing in the smoke-filled air. The ground was littered with the dead and the dying, the air thick with the smell of blood and cordite. The Soviet forces, pressing their advantage, managed to seize the eastern side of Orphanage Hill, establishing a foothold on the strategic height. The German defenders, reeling from the initial assault, rallied to defend their remaining positions, determined to prevent the Soviets from gaining complete control of the hill. The situation was critical, the fate of the Tannenberg line hanging in the balance. Reinforcements from the Langemarck Division, alerted to the Soviet breakthrough, rushed to the scene, arriving just in time to bolster the sagging German defences. These men, Flemish volunteers and battle-hardened veterans, charged into the fray, determined to stem the Soviet advance and to recapture the lost ground. Their arrival injected new energy into the German defence, stiffening their resolve and providing much-needed firepower. During the night, an anti-tank company of the Langemarck Division launched a daring counterattack, seeking to dislodge the Soviets from their newly captured positions on Orphanage Hill. These men, armed with Panzerfausts and other anti-tank weapons, crept through the darkness, stalking their Soviet prey. They struck with deadly precision, destroying several Soviet tanks and inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy infantry. The counterattack, launched with courage and determination, succeeded in recapturing the part of Orphanage Hill that had been lost a few hours earlier. The German defenders, exhausted but elated, dug in, preparing to repel the inevitable Soviet counterattack that would come with the dawn. The night was filled with the sounds of digging, the clatter of shovels against the hard earth, the murmur of voices as men prepared for the coming storm. On the morning of July 27th, Soviet forces, reinforced and resupplied, launched another heavy artillery bombardment of Cinemade, seeking to soften up the German defences before launching another infantry assault. The German defenders, huddled in their bunkers and trenches, endured the bombardment with grim determination, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. Steiner, anticipating an enemy infantry attack, concentrated his few operational armoured vehicles, a mere 7 tanks, just north of the town between Orphanage and Grenadier Hills, hoping to use them as a mobile reserve to counter any Soviet breakthrough. The remnants of the Nordland Division were also positioned there, ready to support the armoured counterattack. The main Soviet attack on that day was concentrated on Orphanage Hill and the members of the Langemarck Division, who were positioned south of the hill. The Soviet forces, employing approximately 50 armoured vehicles, sought to reoccupy the hill and to drive the Germans back towards the Tannenberg line. The attack struck with devastating force, the Soviet tanks churning through the mud and rubble, their guns blazing. The Flemish volunteers of the Langemarck Division, armed with their Panzerfausts, stood their ground, determined to repel the Soviet armoured assault. These men, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, fought with incredible bravery, knocking out 14 Soviet armoured vehicles with their anti-tank weapons. They initially repulsed the attack, driving the Soviet tanks back and inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy infantry. However, the Soviet forces, pressing their advantage, soon overwhelmed the Flemish volunteers, their sheer numbers proving too much to withstand. The Langemarck Division, depleted and exhausted, was forced to abandon their position and retreat to Grenadier Hill, leaving behind approximately 60 men who, together with some Estonians, were tasked with resisting the Soviet attack and covering the retreat of their comrades. Further north of Orphanage Hill, the Soviet Second Shock Army launched another attack, seeking to break through the German lines and to outflank the defenders on Grenadier Hill. This attack, however, was repulsed by Steiner's men, who fought with unwavering determination, inflicting heavy casualties on the attacking Soviet forces. In the end, the only successful attack was the one on Orphanage Hill itself, and after annihilating the few men who remained to cover the retreat of the Flemish soldiers, the Red Army captured it, consolidating their hold on the strategic height. During the early afternoon, while these fierce clashes were taking place, the new commander of Army Group North, Ferdinand Schörner, arrived in the vicinity of the town of Sinimäed. Witnessing the desperate situation firsthand, he ordered immediate counterattacks to be launched to recapture Orphanage Hill, determined to regain control of the strategic height and to restore the integrity of the Tannenberg line. Shortly after a meeting with his commanders, Fritz von Scholz, the commander of the Nordland Division, was struck by a shell fragment in front of his command post and killed. His death, a devastating blow to the German forces, further demoralized the defenders and added to the sense of despair that hung over the battlefield. Following Schörner's order, a Nordland battalion and an Estonian battalion launched a counterattack on Orphanage Hill, seeking to dislodge the Soviet forces from their newly captured positions. The attack, however, failed after suffering heavy losses, the Soviet defenders holding their ground and repelling the German assault with withering fire. Orphanage Hill thus fell permanently under Soviet control, marking a significant setback for the German defenders and further eroding their already precarious position. The soldiers of the 3rd SS Panzer Corps withdrew to Grenadier Hill, their spirits dampened and their ranks depleted, preparing to face the next inevitable Soviet assault. The Soviet artillery, recognizing the strategic importance of Grenadier Hill, concentrated its attacks on this new position, unleashing a devastating barrage of shells upon the German defenders. The ground shuddered under the impact of the explosions, the air filled with the acrid stench of burning fuel and the screams of the wounded and dying. The German defenders, huddled in their foxholes and bunkers, endured the bombardment with grim determination, waiting for the inevitable infantry assault that would follow. The morning of July 28th dawned, grim and grey, promising another day of relentless fighting. The air hung thick with the smell of smoke and decay, the silence punctuated only by the distant rumble of artillery fire. A new Soviet attack was launched, attempting to outflank Grenadier Hill from the north, seeking to bypass the German defences and to cut off the defenders from their supply lines. The attack, spearheaded by waves of infantry and supported by armoured vehicles, struck with relentless force, testing the German resolve to the breaking point. During this engagement, another high-profile action took place, involving a Belgian soldier named Remy Schreinen of the Langemarck Division. Schreinen, a sergeant and a veteran of countless battles, found himself in a desperate situation, facing a seemingly endless wave of Soviet tanks. Armed with a 75mm anti-tank gun known as the Pak-40, he prepared to make his stand. With nerves of steel and unwavering determination, Schreinen engaged the advancing Soviet tanks, his Pak-40 spitting fire and steel. His aim was true, his shots finding their mark with deadly accuracy. One by one, the Soviet tanks succumbed to his relentless assault, their armour pierced and their crews incinerated. In a single, audacious act of defiance, Schreinen destroyed 4 Soviet tanks, halting their advance and buying valuable time for the German defenders. But Schreinen's heroism did not end there. Later that afternoon, as the Soviet forces renewed their assault, he continued to engage the enemy tanks, his Pak-40 roaring in defiance. Again and again his shots found their mark, destroying another 6 Soviet tanks, his actions, a testament to his skill and his courage, earned him the coveted Knight's Cross, a symbol of valour and recognition of extraordinary service in the face of overwhelming odds. The battle ended for the Belgian soldier in a moment of brutal violence. An IS-2 tank, recognising the threat posed by Schraenen's anti-tank gun, charged directly at him, its massive gun blazing. Both guns fired simultaneously, the IS-2's shell striking Schraenen's position with devastating force. The IS-2 was destroyed, its crew annihilated, but the explosion blew Schraenen away from his gun, severely wounding him. He was not found until several hours after the engagement, his body battered and broken, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting. To forestall a German retreat from the hill, the Soviet Air Force bombed the Axis soldiers west of the hill, seeking to cut off their escape route and to trap them in a deadly encirclement. The German defenders, however, refused to yield, holding their ground against the aerial onslaught and repelling the Soviet attacks with unwavering determination. The men of the Langemarck Division, despite their heavy losses and their depleted ranks, advanced into no man's land again, seeking to push back the Soviet forces and to relieve the pressure on Grenadier Hill. Their attack, launched with courage and desperation, succeeded in repulsing the Russian assault, but at a terrible cost. The Langemarck Division was virtually annihilated, its fighting strength reduced to a mere handful of survivors. Because of this, it was unable to participate in another major engagement that same night. The Germans, however, were not idle. They attempted to recapture Orphanage Hill, launching a series of desperate counterattacks against the Soviet defenders, but all of their attacks were repulsed by the Russians, who held their ground with unwavering resolve. Finally, Steiner, recognizing the futility of further attacks and the desperate situation on Grenadier Hill, ordered the withdrawal of all forces to the new defensive line on Grenadier Hill, consolidating his remaining troops and preparing to face the next inevitable Soviet assault. On July 29th, intense Soviet artillery bombardment began again, raining down a torrent of shells upon Grenadier Hill. The German defenders, well entrenched and dug in, suffered relatively few casualties, their bunkers and trenches providing some protection from the artillery barrage. But the psychological impact of the bombardment was devastating, the constant explosions and the fear of death taking their toll on the men's nerves. After the artillery attack ceased, approximately 6,000 Soviet soldiers, supported by armoured vehicles, attacked Grenadier Hill, seeking to overwhelm the German defenders and to seize the strategic height. The 109th Rifle Division assaulted the northern flank, defended by the Netherland Division, while the 72nd and 120th Rifle Divisions attacked the Estonian soldiers from the east. The fighting was fierce and brutal, a chaotic melee of close-quarters combat. The flanking attack from the north was repulsed by the Dutch volunteers of the Netherland Division, who fought with unwavering determination, inflicting heavy losses on the attacking Soviet forces. The Dutch soldiers, armed with their machine guns and Panzerfausts, stood their ground against the Soviet onslaught, repelling wave after wave of attackers and preventing them from breaking through the German lines. However, to the south, the Soviets were able to encircle the defenders, reaching the hill of Love Hill, a strategic height located west of Grenadier Hill. The German bunkers that had been built there were poorly defended and were destroyed one after another, the Soviet forces gaining control of the hill. In addition, the Soviet armoured vanguard managed to reach the town of Vivera, marking the furthest point of the Russian advance until September of that same year. This penetration threatened to encircle Felix Steiner's troops further east, trapping them in a deadly pocket and potentially leading to their complete destruction. By midday on July 29th, Soviet forces had almost captured most of the Tannenberg defensive line, their relentless attacks pushing the German defenders to the brink of collapse. However, the top of the two westernmost hills were still holding out, the German soldiers clinging to their positions with desperate tenacity. On the other hand, Steiner ordered his last tanks to try to hold the road between Tallinn and Narva, the vital supply route that sustained his forces. He knew that if the Soviets cut this road, his troops would be trapped and doomed. The German panzers, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, headed towards Vivera, engaging the Soviet forces in a series of fierce firefights. Their attack, launched with courage and determination, forced the Soviet forces to retreat, relieving the pressure on the German defenders and preventing them from being encircled. While this attack was taking place, the Soviets captured Love Hill after much effort, consolidating their hold on the western approaches to Grenadier Hill. The loss of Love Hill was a significant setback for the German defenders, further eroding their already precarious position and exposing them to Soviet fire from the west. After much effort, a group of Norwegian and Estonian soldiers were able to retake Love Hill, suffering heavy losses in the process. Their counterattack, launched with courage and determination, succeeded in dislodging the Soviet forces from the hill, restoring the integrity of the German lines and preventing a complete breakthrough. At this point in the battle, heavy fighting was taking place along the entire line, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The ground was littered with the dead and the dying, the air thick with the smell of blood and cordite. The German and Soviet soldiers, exhausted and battered, fought with a desperate ferocity driven by a mixture of fear, duty, and ideological conviction. The outcome of the battle remained uncertain, the fate of the Tannenberg line hanging in the balance. In total, the Soviets launched 8 attacks to capture Grenadier Hill. Each assault met with fierce resistance from the German defenders. The fighting was intense, the casualties heavy, but the German soldiers held their ground, repelling wave after wave of Soviet attackers. By the 30th of July, a massive artillery attack wiped out most of Steiner's soldiers still holding Grenadier Hill under German control. The bombardment was devastating, pulverizing the German bunkers and trenches and inflicting heavy casualties on the defenders. But despite the heavy losses, the German soldiers refused to yield, clinging to their positions with desperate tenacity. However, a new Soviet infantry and armoured attack to take the hill failed again, the German defenders repelling the assault with withering fire. The Soviet forces lost at least 12 tanks in the attack, their advance blunted by the German anti-tank defences. Despite the heavy losses, the Soviet Second Shock Army failed to achieve its objectives during the month of July. The Tannenberg line remained unbroken, the German defenders holding their ground against overwhelming odds. The battle had been a costly stalemate, with both sides suffering terrible casualties. In August, the lines were reorganised and there was a lull in the fighting, allowing both sides to regroup and to replenish their depleted forces. The respite, however, was brief, both sides preparing for the next inevitable round of fighting. Although the SS units inflicted heavy losses on the Russians, they also suffered significant casualties, their fighting strength severely depleted. By this time, the strength of the Netherland division amounted to 1 regiment, a mere fraction of its original strength, and the Langemarck division to only several reinforced companies, its ranks decimated by weeks of relentless fighting. On the other hand, the 2nd Estonian Regiment ceased to exist as an effective unit, its soldiers either killed, wounded, or captured. Between the 29th of July and the 10th of August, the Russians continued to launch multiple attacks without success, seeking to break through the German lines and to seize the Tannenberg line. But the German defenders, despite their heavy losses and their depleted ranks, held their ground, repelling every Soviet assault with unwavering determination. Finally, on August 10th, the Leningrad Front War Council ordered a halt to attacks on the Tannenberg line, recognizing the futility of further assaults and the heavy losses they were incurring. The battle had reached a stalemate, both sides exhausted and depleted. The battle left a devastating balance, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting and the terrible cost of war. The German forces suffered approximately 10,000 casualties, along with 12 tanks lost. The Soviet forces, however, suffered far greater losses, with more than 100,000 casualties and 160 tanks lost. The Blue Hills had become a graveyard, a place of death and destruction, a testament to human folly and the futility of war. The hills of Love Hill and Grenadier remained under German control until mid-September, when Army Group North had to retreat due to the danger of being surrounded, their position untenable in the face of the advancing Soviet forces. The retreat marked the end of the Battle of the Blue Hills, a chapter of brutal fighting and unimaginable carnage. A few weeks later, the entire Army Group North, with at least 30 divisions, was surrounded in Courland, their fate sealed. The war was drawing to a close, the German Reich collapsing under the weight of its own hubris and its own misdeeds. The Battle of the Blue Hills, though a relatively small engagement in the context of the Second World War, serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict, the futility of ideological hatred, and the enduring power of the human spirit to endure and to resist in the face of overwhelming